Welcome. Good to see you all again. For those of you I haven't met, my name is Matt Petersen. I'm NAGDCA's Executive Director. Our topic today is an important one. As you all know, we had an election, and it will have a significant impact on our industry in the very near future. There's a lot to cover, so we want to get to it quickly. But before we begin, I wanted to let you know a few things. We are recording this presentation. You may have seen that. It will be emailed to all of you as registrants. It will also be posted on the website, and we'll send it out afterwards. You'll be muted for the duration of the webinar, but please submit your questions throughout the presentation in the Q&A box in the menu at the bottom of your screen. Your questions are only going to be visible to me and Michael and Diana, so feel free to send those anytime. We'll get to as many as we can. We know you probably have a few. We also have a chat feature open, which you may use with us anytime, like if we're having trouble or with the presentation, okay? So without further ado, joining me today to discuss the 2025 election and what it means for retirement policy, we have Michael Kreps, Brigen Winters. Welcome, Brigen. Glad you made it.
All right, Wayne.
Diana McDonald from Groom Law. So welcome to all of you, our partners over at Groom. All right, let's dive right in. So a lot has happened since many of us met in Phoenix for the NAGDCA annual conference. What seems like a long time ago, but it really wasn't. We speculated then a bit. Michael, you were on that panel with me on the election then, but now we know. We have our answers. So, Michael, I'm going to turn it over to you for the easy job. I think everybody probably knows, but maybe they don't. So, if you can, would you walk us through what happened and where the election results sit today?
Sure. The election, I think, defied some expectations and met others. It was close in terms of the overall vote count, but former President Trump is now President-elect Trump. Obviously, he won, not quite a landslide or anything like that, but with a decisive electoral college victory and his biggest total in all three of his elections in the popular vote count. The Senate changed hands. It will be in Republican control come January, and they will have a three-seat majority, it looks like. Although one race, I think the Democrats still hasn't conceded. There's still some open issues, but it's clearly going to be in Republican control. And then the House, the count usually takes a while just because there's so many districts, but that looks to be firmly in Republican control, likely with a slightly expanded majority.
Okay, great. So, Diana, maybe you want to talk a little bit about, Michael mentioned that the Senate is going to have a three-seat majority. So that means it's not filibuster-proof, right? But what does that mean in the Senate for the dynamic? We changed from Democrat majority to Republican majority. How does that play out with a tight margin like this?
Right. So it is a tight margin, and there's a tight margin today just in the other party's favor. And so the filibuster exists because senators want it to exist. Senate rules are not enshrined in the Constitution, like the filibuster that is not in the Constitution. It can be changed at the pleasure of the senators. And, we've seen it change for lower court judges. Will it change for more judges? That remains to be seen, right? It'll stick around as long as senators want it to.
Okay. So that changes the dynamic a little bit, right? Because even though there's a majority, even though there's 53 Republicans, there could be issues where some aren't all aligned, right? Brigen, is that accurate? Right. So it doesn't create necessarily a straight line on everything for all laws.
That's right. I mean, it's going to be a slightly bigger majority in Republicans' favor this time. As of literally 20 minutes ago, there's going to be a new majority leader. Senator Thune was just elected to replace Senator McConnell, who's been the majority leader for, I think, the longest time in history. So that's going to be a big change. But with 53 seats, there's a little bit of margin, where they can lose a couple people and still, for example, get nominees through or move legislation. But it's not going to be easy. And as long as the filibuster remains, which as of now it does, and I don't anticipate them totally going away from it, although there could be pressures like we've seen over the last several years, it will still that's still going to be a governor on how much Congress can do. That said, there is, and we can dive more into this if you want, there will now be a path if the House does stay in Republican hands for them to do, for Republicans to do a budget resolution and do budget reconciliation instructions under which they can move spending and tax provisions. And as long as they stay in certain parameters and meet some rules, they can then get, for example, tax legislation through the Senate with just a majority vote. So that's going to be a big thing to watch out.
Okay, yeah, let's talk about that in a minute. But before we turn to 2025, we still have a couple weeks left in 2024, and there are a few things left to do. So very much a lame duck session. A lot's about to change, but we got about 6 weeks left. Michael, you want to talk about, or any of you interested in talking about what has to pass? There are a few things that have to pass. And then what else is being looked at as we get into the end of the year that maybe Democrats will try to push through or at least emphasize before things change over?
Sure. There are a couple bigger bills. The biggest one and the most important one is they have to fund the government. Diana will correct me, keep me honest on this. I think the current funding package expires on the 20th, which is purposefully backed up. That deadline's purposely backed up to right before Christmas to put some pressure on people to get it done. Historically, Congress has at times done those kind of year-end spending packages in the lame duck, said kumbaya and trying to clear the deck and push everything through at the last minute as much as they can. They've done that a number of times. And in other cases, they've kind of shut down and decided we're just going to punt till next year when the political dynamics are different. We don't know which direction they'll take on this year. I suspect, given that Republicans got a kind of a clean sweep, that they'll likely want to push a lot of this government funding discussion till next year, and they'll pass something shorter and more modest to prevent the government from shutting down. I don't know if Diana has any thoughts on the other bills that are on the other key bills that are
Yeah, sure.
must-dos.
Yeah, there is, of course, disaster spending, right? We've seen that horrible hurricane and flooding in North Carolina. FEMA's pockets have run dry and they need an infusion of cash. And of course, there's wildfires out west again. So really FEMA needs that. So we're expecting a supplemental spending bill there for disaster aid, and then farm bill and defense bill. Like every year. Yeah. So those are big ones.
So a lot of times, they'll try to attach some things to the bills that are coming through at the end of the year. Are there any retirement related provisions that have a possibility? I know we've been talking about technical corrections for a while. None of those seem for Secure 2.0. None of those seem, necessarily to affect the NAGDCA crowd too much, but we're still waiting on those. And then things like recently there was a vote in the House on the WEP and the GPO, the windfall elimination program, and the government pension offset for Social Security, which would affect those of you who aren't in Social Security participating states. Is there any possibility, because there is the farm bill, the defense bill, some of these big bills that are coming through, do any retirement provisions sneak in, and would they have any impact on our folks, before things change over?
Well, the WEP GPO provision doesn't directly impact us, but it does impact kind of retirement security more broadly and the interaction between public and private systems. The challenge with that has just always been cost. I think folks have been interested in reforming the provisions for a long time, since the provisions were put in place originally, and they just haven't made a lot of progress and been able to get it over the finish line just because the cost is high. So that is likely still a barrier, but it's not a permanent barrier, and it's only a barrier to the extent that Congress feels compelled to try and pay for that policy change. The other big one, as you mentioned, Matt, is technical corrections. There's a very good chance, I don't think it's guaranteed, but there's a decent to good chance that those provisions could be included either in the spending bill or as part of the Defense Authorization Act or somewhere else. That's possible. And there's some chatter about including a provision in a year-end package to allow 403Bs to invest in CITs, but I think that's kind of up in the air as well too. Just a lot remains to be determined, and it will really depend now that the members are back and ready to start work again, how much they can really do in this post-election period when emotions are probably still pretty high. People have pretty strong feelings about what happened. Republicans are saying, you know, we've got majorities next year. We can do what we want. Why do it now? We've got Democrats saying we're not going to lift a finger to help the other side. So I think it's always a little difficult, but there's a chance, and there's a decent chance that they come together.
I guess, you know, the WEP GPO provision got through the House on a discharge petition, very kind of rare that occurs, but it has so much bipartisan support. And there's a little drama in the last several days. I guess then I think there's like 62 Senate co-sponsors. So that one has a little bit of momentum onto itself, although you have the cost issue. I think on secure technicals and probably other things that are, you know, that we're following, including some telehealth things in the health space, it's going to be more dependent on, is there a big enough package to carry other things along with it? And that may depend on where they decide to go on the spending side, whether they do a big omnibus bill or really kind of kick the can. And that's what we'll be kind of be on the lookout for. It's hard to see a lot of things that don't fall in the technicals bucket in the retirement space making it in, but I'm sure I think there will be attempts on the CIT 403B provision and some other securities provisions, given the dynamic and who's going to be coming in as ranking member on committees, et cetera. I think Senator Warren, I believe, is in line to be the ranking at banking. Mike, do I have that right? So I think that could drive a little activity in that space as well.
For sure.
Okay. And just to be clear, you know, so we make sure people understand the technical corrections for Secure 2.0 don't address a lot of the questions that our members really have. You know, it's not the same as guidance that we would get from IRS. It's more just, you know, was the law maybe written a little bit wrong, or did they have to, you know, change some very minor aspects of the actual legislation to, you know, clean up some of the topics that they wrote on. It wouldn't, for example, address you know, issues about the Roth catch-up provision or anything like that we've been focused on, and we will talk about that a bit in a bit. But the technical corrections are really exactly that, just kind of some technical writing for improvements to the law that passed a couple of years ago. And then the score, like you talked about, Brigen and Michael, you both mentioned the expense of the weapon GPO provision. It sounded like it was about $196 billion was the number that had come through from the Congressional Budget Office, the expense of eliminating the weapon GPO. So not a small provision, but one that some folks are pretty adamantly fighting for. Okay, so that kind of sums up what we've got to expect over the next maybe 6 weeks, right? And really less than that, I guess. Congress, you know, they're not working on Thanksgiving or Christmas either, I don't suppose, although, or not formally, I guess. So pretty limited time for the lame duck session, and then we're going to start a transition to a new administration. Can you talk a little bit, any of you that are interested, about what that looks like what is it that the president's going to be doing over these next couple of months to get ready come January 20th?
Yeah, I think there are basically two big things that happen. Thing number one is the president and his team need to start picking people. They need to start picking leadership. And you already see that in the press. They're talking about Treasury Secretary candidates and UN ambassadors are filling, they're at least starting to talk about filling those top spots. The second thing they need to do then is on January 20th, the minute the inauguration happens, they need to take over the agencies. And that usually involves setting up what they call transition teams. These are teams of people who are not intended necessarily to be full-time permanent staffers at these agencies, but they're often policy and political people who leave their day jobs for a period of time to work at the agency to basically hold down the fort until they can get political officials appointed.
And when you say agency, you're talking IRS, the Department of Labor.
All of them, right? Exactly. IRS, Department of Labor, SEC, not SEC, put that aside. All of the major federal agencies have these kind of transition teams that descend on them.
Okay. And what's the task of those transition teams? What are they working through?
They typically come in, and the first thing they do is put a halt on everything the prior administration was working on. So they kind of say, unless what you're doing is so important to national security that it has to go through, we're going to take a fresh look at all regulations, everything proposed, everything that's still kind of not even finalized but not effective. And they usually put a freeze on all that stuff. And then they will begin to set priorities for the next administration while they're waiting on permanent staff. So they'll start to develop an agenda, priority items, and they'll also work with the Senate to get senior nominees through the Senate confirmation process, which is, can be grueling on people and is a challenge.
Even when the majorities are kind of aligned in all the.
Exactly.
Okay. What about in the House and Senate? There will be some transition there too. Obviously in the Senate, there's a change in the majorities. So that kicks in a lot of process change, but even in the House where, the Republicans will still be in the majority, it's a time of change. And so, there tends to be some movement when it comes to committees and, sort of the groups that make things happen, I guess, in the legislative arenas. Do any of you want to talk about what that part looks like in the House and Senate over the next couple of months?
Sure. I've been kind of in prison. I was late. I've been presenting a couple other meetings presenting, so I checked
It's a busy time
this
in
morning.
Washington.
I know the Senate. I know what happened with the Senate race. I think there was going to be a House leadership races as well. It's happening literally today. They will vote on the leader. For Mike Johnson presumably will stay the leader given the likely outcome of the election. The vote on him being speaker will not occur. That's a vote of the full House. That won't occur until the full House convenes early next year, I think January 3rd. But they're doing their leadership races. That in turn will then kick off what are known as steering committees, like very heavily focused on House leadership and other key members that will then work on committee assignments, and in particular in the House Republican caucus, where it's not done really mostly, solely by seniority, which has traditionally been the case in the House. They will have a lot of say in kind of voting on who gets the key chairmanships of the committees. Right now, it looks like most likely the Ways and Means chairman Jason Smith will probably retain that gavel. There's been some thought that there could be a challenge from Representative Buchanan from Florida, who challenged for it last time. But it looks like Smith, I would guess Smith will retain that role. The other committee we look at in the retirement field for ERISA and ERISA related stuff is the Education and the Workforce Committee. There, the chair, Virginia Fox, is term limited. She actually got a pass to get an extra 2-year term this past Congress, but that's up. It can be renewed, so there will be a couple of members vying for that. Likely Representative Wahlberg has the most seniority. He's done a lot of work in the retirement space, but also Burgess Owens might challenge for that. So several changes there. I think a little more on Senate Finance, another big committee for us. That's likely just to flip-flop the chair and ranking members. Senator Crapo will become chair instead of ranking member. Senator Wyden will become ranking member instead of chair. That will also, there will be some changes in who's on the committee. In the Senate, that will be a handful of people. If there are vacancies, will be filled by people of that party. I haven't kind of looked to see if anybody has to come off, given the ratios will change a little bit. But and then I think Senate Health, we'll kind of have to see kind of what happens there. There could be a little more fluidity, but right now, Senator Cassidy looks like would be the chair unless something happens, like Senator Paul kind of reclaims his seniority. there could be changes in the ranking members a lot. We've heard. So just a lot. There's gonna be a lot of watching how that plays out, how committee assignments get dished out, and those will be the people we'll be dealing with in the next Congress.
And if I could add a couple of things, Brigen, I know you mentioned Chairwoman Fox being term limited. That is a House Republican caucus rule, if I believe. So that does not apply to House Democrats, and folks over in the Senate do their own thing. And then as far as the Senate, oh no, excuse me, back in the House, either way, with leadership for these parties, last Congress, we were very late starting because lawmakers could not decide on a speaker. And without a speaker, you don't have those steering committees to set the committees and go on down the chain. And so long as it seems like we're cruising right through leadership right now with Speaker Johnson and Leader Thune. So we should have a pretty quick start out of the gate in 2025.
And just to recap, so for those committees, Senate Finance, House Ways and Means, they're kind of focused on tax and how the money is spent, right? And so retirement falls into their jurisdiction quite often. Also, Education and Workforce, and the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, more focused on ERISA, but also end up writing a lot of the laws that affect us. So when we go to Washington on your behalf, and the team from Groom engages with Washington when I'm not there, those are the folks typically that we're meeting with. So those will be new folks for the most part in the coming year, which keeps us busy and also means that we have a little bit of education to do, right? Because public sector DC plans are not always top of mind for those folks, especially the two committees that are focused on ERISA. They are very focused on writing things that are specific to ERISA. So we'll be working to make sure that they understand that not all defined contribution plans out there are ERISA, and that includes all of yours. So very important structurally to make sure that the committees, to understand how the committees function and understand who's in charge of them. And those folks are the ones who set the tone for next year, right? So let's talk a little bit about next year. There's a very big bill coming through, and it's going to probably consume a lot of the early part of 2025, I would assume, legislatively. So do any of you want to take the dive in and talk about the expiring provisions of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act?
I don't want to take the start. I just want to note that I think it's fun that you said it was only going to be the early part of the year.
Well, all
It's
right.
going to be the entire year to the last minute.
There you go. There you go.
That is a bold prediction.
Too much optimism. Early part, like the first 6 months, maybe. Okay.
I mean, it is going to dominate things, and it is the kind of the background is the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was the in the first Trump administration, the big tax bill that went through under budget reconciliation. As a result of some of those rules I mentioned, include those types of bills under a budget resolution get the special treatment in the Senate, but they also have limitations, including they need to be primarily geared at affecting the budget, revenues, or spending. And can only do so within the budget window, which is typically 10 years. In this case, they basically did all of the tax changes in an 8-year period and then set those to expire. That expiration date will be next December 31 of 2025. In the meantime, there have been a number of other provisions that have been lined up with expiration dates to fall at the same time, including the ACA, Affordable Care Act, premium enhanced subsidies. If you add the costs of extending all of those expiring provisions up, the Congressional Budget Office back in the late spring, summer estimated that would be in the $4.6 trillion range. You could add a little bit more to that if you look at some of the policies that, for example, passed the House this Congress, didn't make it through the Senate, to deal with some of the corporate provisions and add to the child tax credit on the individual side. If you add to that some of the Trump campaign proposals, for example, no taxes on overtime or tips or Social Security benefits, we're probably talking several more $1 trillion. So I think a lot of what we're gonna be looking at and probably advocating on is to make sure that there aren't attempts to pay for some of those extensions or policy changes through cutting limits or tax benefits or changing the rules in the retirement system. An example of that in 2016, 2017, in the lead up to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was an attempt by the Ways and Means Committee chairman to pay for some of those provisions through what we refer to as Rothification, the system, switching it to after-tax contributions with Roth benefits on the way out instead of pre-tax up front. So I think that's going to consume a lot of our attention, along with talking to them about new ideas we might have and things we didn't get done in Secure 2.0 or things that need to be fixed. So we're going to need to be kind of really monitoring that and making sure they don't do adverse things that could affect our plans.
Okay.
Michael,
There's
Diana,
a
anything
lot to break down in there. So I'm gonna try to take it piece by piece. So the 2017 Tax Cuts Jobs Act, the provisions from that bill, most of them are set to expire after 8 years. Why would Congress do that? Michael, you wanna take that one?
Yeah,
Thank
I definitely, it seems weird, right, that you pass a bunch of tax cuts and then say, well, part of it's permanent, part of it's not, and it just boils down to how they pass the bill and some of the control measures they put in place. They passed it without Democratic support through a process called reconciliation. And that's a budgetary process that has the procedural benefit of getting bills passed with a simple majority vote. So you don't need any minority support. But that comes at a cost, and that's you have limitations on what you can do. And so part of the expiration is due to the fact that the reconciliation rules effectively force them to sunset some of the provisions out in year 8.
Okay. And so when we talk about a number, like when we talk about, this bill is going to cost you mentioned extending the provisions for permanently would cost $4.6 trillion. That means over the next 10 years, a 10-year window, which is what they look at to run those budget numbers, the cost of essentially lost revenue, right? So we're talking about tax revenue, and if we're cutting taxes, there's less revenue coming in. The cost of that lost revenue is $4.6 trillion over that 10-year period. So that's additive to what is right now about a $1.8 trillion per year deficit. So big numbers, right? We're talking about some pretty big numbers to add to the deficit side. And so Diana, maybe you can talk a little bit. They are looking at extending some of the cuts, looking at maybe getting rid of some things. And Brigen talked a little bit about paying for those cuts and the idea that that 4.6 trillion number, or like you said, Brigen, could be much larger depending on how many things are proposed. I've seen everywhere from 7 to 15 trillion over a 10-year period thrown out. Congress is going to be looking for things to add revenue back. And so how does changing our accounts, changing a DC plan, a 457 plan deferral from before tax to after tax affect that score, and how does Congress think about that?
So Congress operates on a 10-year budget window. And if you are doing after-tax accounts, and that tax is collected right now, that means that tax is coming in inside this 10-year window. So 2025 to 2034, and not sometime down the future for future lawmakers.
Who cares, right? Yeah.
Yeah, nobody cares about the future lawmakers. They can make their own problems. And so, yeah, so it's about how much money can we get right now inside this window. And so messing with readjusting retirement plans is just an accounting gimmick. It is truly about how much revenue can we put inside that 10-year window. But when you're desperate and there are trillions of things to pay for, you will do things like accounting gimmicks to try to make some things look better. And it's not that it is real money coming in. It's just there's no money coming in for future governments after the 10-year window to rely on.
Right. So when all those people start to retire and they are able to withdraw their money tax-free, there's a bill to pay later on, but that's not inside of that 10-year budget window, so it's not accounted for in this process. And that's why.
A lot of the frustration with the typical pre-tax deferral treatment is the failure of that budgetary approach to realize that all that money does come out eventually and get taxed, including the contributions and the earnings, as opposed to some other what are known as tax incentives. These are the Joint Committee on Taxation, which does the scoring of tax bills for Congress, just like the Congressional Budget Office does for kind of everything else on the spending side, has come up with that terminology to look against a baseline. If that set of rules, say the retirement rules or health rules, didn't exist, what would be the revenue to the government? And as a result of that scoring system, retirement and health end up basically your top two tax incentives, over things like the mortgage interest deduction and other things you might be aware of. So that's kind of our vulnerability. I think it's a symptom of the success of the system that there are a number of rules in place to incent those plans and incent contributions to those plans and saving for retirement, but it's also a vulnerability given the budgetary situation with a $2 trillion current deficit and a bunch of expiring provisions that are due.
And I know it's very early in the process. Ratification is obviously a major way, that money could come in now, as you mentioned, Diana. Are there other provisions out there or other mechanisms that you all have heard about that may be on the table? I know it's obviously very early in the process, like I said, and the thinking on this is probably just getting going, but it's also usually provisions that we've seen before, right? Are there other things that might be thrown out there as ways to raise revenue to pay for some of the tax cuts?
And again, nothing's really been proposed this time. And like in 2016, 2017, there was it's clearly kind of they started moving that, looking at the ratification proposal. Here, I think we're just anticipating what might happen. I think you're right. I think it would be some things that have been proposed in the past. You could see more direct cuts to contribution limits or benefit limits under the 415 and those the elective deferral type limits. That's the most direct way you could do it. You could do proposals that are more geared at the top, aggregate limits that we've seen proposed by Senator Wyden and Representative Neal, but that could put in place a limit that could be dialable. You could dial it down over time and affect more people. You could also do more indirect things, and I think this is something some of the Democratic candidates and budget proposals have looked at, is reducing the tax benefits by, for example, saying when you make a pre-tax deduction, your deduction is capped at, say, a 50% bracket or some lower bracket than your actual marginal rate, which has the effect of taking away some of the tax benefits and essentially ended up at some double taxation there. If when you take it out, you pay tax at the full rate. So there may be others, but I think there's a smorgasbord of things they could do, none of which would be great. Maybe some things would be less great than others, but I think we'd probably be concerned about any of those, or at least a lot of those, as to the impact they could have on plan formation and plan retention.
Worth flagging, because usually when we say stuff like this, like they'll do ratification, they'll cut this, and people will immediately say, and completely reasonably, why would they do something that would negatively impact retirement security? Why would they do this? And I think the answer isn't malice towards the system or anything like that. It's more that they have a lot of competing priorities, and And they're just trying to figure out, they know someone is going to take a hit somewhere for raising revenue. It's either because you increase taxes and people don't like that, or you're getting rid of programs or something else that people like. And so they know people are going to be upset, and they're just looking for the easiest large buckets of revenue that they can pull in. And they think at times that would be the retirement system, and that they won't get a lot of political opposition. I think in 2017 that wasn't the case. There was a lot of political opposition. There probably will be this time too. The other reason I just want to flag is there is a policy disagreement about how much the federal government should subsidize retirement and health benefits. And you see this in some of the thought leadership that was done around the campaign on the Republican side, where they, in Project 2025, put out a report, which is not, I don't think was blessed by the campaign or anything like that, but reflects some thinking from that world. And that report kind of questions whether the preference for health and retirement under the tax code improperly incentivizes wage packages to skew towards benefits and away from wages, cash wages. And that is something you have to take seriously. That is a legitimate policy criticism of the system that could drive policy.
So kind of a philosophical argument there.
Exactly.
For whether to prefer, which one to prefer.
Exactly.
So when we're talking, we talked a little bit about the number from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act side, how much it would cost to kind of maintain, the status quo. How much and I know the numbers probably haven't been around for a little while, but what kind of ballpark are we talking about if we were to Rothify all retirement savings? How much money does that gain? So what kind of a number are they looking at to say, is this appealing or not? Do we have, again, I know that hasn't been run for a little while, but is there a kind of a ballpark on how much money that would nominally gain?
I don't recall the exact number. At times the numbers have ranged, because a lot depends on the contours of how you do it. But I do remember $100 billion a year being floated around at one point, and the only reason I remember that is because they equated it to a percentage that was the cost essentially of a 1% reduction in the corporate tax rate. So Rothification basically would have paid for that, and that was kind of the best ballpark number I've got.
Okay.
That's what I recurred as well. And then they started looking at ways to dial that back and, maybe say half of your contributions, and it kind of went from there. But that's the ballpark. I'm not aware of any, recent scoring. If that occurred, it's all behind the scenes as they game plan, for next year. But I think that's probably the order of magnitude.
Okay. And so we're at least talking in the hundreds of billions of dollars, which probably, like I said, makes it a bit of an appealing provision to consider if you're trying to pay for a different big number. So, okay. I want to go back to something you talked a little bit about, Michael, when you talked about the transition teams and just how that process works on the regulatory side and the agency side. So we always, when we send out the registration link for our webinars, we always allow people to ask questions in advance. All of those questions, none of them actually pertain to next year. They all pertain to Secure 2.0 and getting clarification on items such as the Roth catch-up, who's responsible for tracking the $145,000 limit, the super catch-up, whether you kind of pinning down whether it's actually optional. If you're offering a 50 catch-up, is it optional to offer the 60 catch-up? All of those things we would get through guidance, right? We would get from the, usually the IRS or Treasury or an agency would say, here's our judgment on those things. Does the transition and that transition team process speed up maybe the guidance that we would get? They probably have been working on it for a couple of years. Does it not impact the timelines that we could expect, or does it slow those things down because everybody will be focused elsewhere as we look ahead?
Yeah, it generally slows things down anytime there's a change in administration, and it's just the fact that when the incoming administration, being from a different kind of political bent, they'll want to take a fresh look at everything and won't just allow things to continue in the way they were under the prior administration. So it may incentivize the Biden administration to get some stuff out quickly at the end of the year. The challenge with that approach, and administrations will do that particularly around things they don't think are political or particularly policy heavy, just technical documents. The challenge with that is that those types of guidance documents often aren't durable, meaning the incoming administration will say that's a midnight regulation. You publish that in the waning days of your power. We're going to pull it back and reevaluate it. So we may get, even if we got some guidance, it doesn't always. You don't know if it's going to stick for 3 or 4 months into the new administration, and then it'll just take the new folks time to get going, right? So the transition team will make some calls, but they're not going to make all the big calls. Those will be deferred to formal established leadership when they get those people in place. So it just generally does slow down the guidance process considerably.
Okay. So even for things like, I mean, how to understand Roth catch-ups and some of the different nuances, even those type of things could be a little bit in flux, or are they uncontroversial enough that nobody would really care enough to pull them back?
And we think they're pretty close on that guidance, so I think there's a chance that comes out. I think that was in line to come out. I would hope that happens. I know everybody needs it and wants it, and
I'm gonna quote you on it if it doesn't. We're gonna put
time's gonna be upon us,
Right.
but I was just presenting to a group of our a big group of our tax people, and there was a lot of there's some concern in some circles about remember last administration there was the 2-for-1 proposal under the Trump administration. Now I think in the campaign we talked about 10 regs go away for every one new one. So I think there is some worry on that front in practitioner land. I know from our perspective, and I think your members' perspective, we want more IRS guidance than less, and that's not the case in other areas, say EPA regulations, for example, or things of that sort. So that'll be something we'll have to monitor. I'm hopeful that. I think last time the way it played out is maybe the tax regulations were seen a little differently, but that will be something we will have to be on the lookout for.
Okay. So maybe, I'm not going to quote you on it. I promise I won't, but maybe some guidance on the Roth catch-up provision before the end of the year. I have heard that the end of the year, before the end of the year is kind of the time frame, which is getting pretty close. Any other items that are on the list that you're hearing about as potentially being kind of the first ones out the door, or still kind of up on deck as we look at getting guidance on, say, rollovers or portability or pluses or anything like that?
I know that I think the long-term part-time that proposed rule, there was some thought that could be finalized, if not this year, soon into next year. That also the EPCRS, these are the corrections, kind of the self-corrections, that kind of the next version, expanded version of that. Those are the things that IRS has been saying in their speaking engagements as to their priorities. They've been doing a lot of work. Mike can comment on this, on portability issues generally, as well as getting ready for the Savers match. I think to me, I put all that in a bucket. Plus, there's some other reports that studies are required to do under directions under Secure 2.0. I think there's going to be a lot of tension, and Mike has been spending a lot of time on this, kind of how the whole plumbing works as to portability and rollovers. And I think there'll be more to come on that, Mike. I'm not sure anything's imminent though.
Yeah, I'm not sure anything's imminent. The kind of nice part about our political system and the way the agencies run, at least for now, is that you've got this turnover in the political officials at the highest levels, but the career staff mostly stays, and so they'll keep plugging along. And things that are where the industry or some group has said we need this, it has to happen. If if it doesn't happen, we can't comply with the law. Those are the types of things that get prioritized. The optional building, optional programs, optional plan features, whether that's, a lost and found for missing participant accounts or missing accounts, or it's pluses. It doesn't really matter. Those are optional things. And so those usually get pushed down the road further. I do think that at least at the Treasury Department, there is a considerable amount of carryover from administration to administration, and a lot of the must-do things will probably stay in the pipeline. There'll just be kind of a new layer of political review layered on top of that for a while.
Okay. Shifting gears a bit, and this is just kind of a general question about governmental plans. Do you know, there's been a fairly clear line between ERISA and the kind of sovereignty of states to run their own state and local plans. Is there any? It's not always philosophically aligned with some of the think tanks, at least, that we've seen on the Republican side. Is there any appetite, do you think, for kind of looking at public plans and implementing any federal oversight or anything like that? Have you heard any discussions about that? I have not, but just curious to know if those type of things are being discussed at all, or if there are other areas to focus, and so it's not really going to be an issue anytime soon.
Yeah, I do think there's a fair amount of interest in public plans. That comes in three forms. One is kind of investment related ESG type issues. Two is around kind of disclosure for DB plans. And three is, well, are these plans properly regulated, or do we need to impose ERISA on them? I think that third one, the kind of like broad federal public plan version of ERISA, it's always got people that support it, and every couple of years it rears its head. But that was a hot debate topic in the passage of ERISA 50 years ago, and we haven't seen it. So it's really unlikely that we get kind of a wide scale, all the plans have to be subject to ERISA. But there are a lot of members who would like to see kind of some more clarification around the exclusive benefit rule when it comes to investments and what you can and can't consider. And there's always a fair amount of interest from folks concerned about public pension, defined benefit pensions, around requiring just funding disclosures at the federal level. And we see that in some of the Republican thought leadership.
Okay, but nothing imminent that you're seeing anywhere that would
Nothing imminent
involve that. Okay, good to hear. So we'll close up with, there were a few, when we met in Phoenix, we talked about a few of the different policy proposals that had been put on the table. So Neil had put forward an auto IRA kind of national program. Hickenlooper from Colorado had heard a kind of something like a TSP for all, like a single plan that was run by the government and also matched by the government. Those were Democratic proposals. I don't know of any, I don't recall any kind of clear Republican proposals. Are those dead for now? I assume those kind of go to sleep for a little while and maybe stay on the list, but is there any chance those will be debated, or is the conversation on those kind of stopped until Democrats come back?
I think it's stopped. It is important to note the Hickenlooper proposal was a bipartisan proposal with Senator Tillis in the Senate, and I think there's a bipartisan sponsors in the House. That said, I think it is, and the proposal's gotten a little bit of support from some more right-wing think tanks, kind of in the think tank world. I think all of that is on the back burner now, is my view. I think the auto IRA, auto 401k will stay kind of front and center for some of certainly Congressman Neal and some Democratic leaders, but I don't see those getting much traction. And frankly, I'm not sure we're going to move too fast toward a next round of 3.0 or whatever you call it, reform, especially given what's on the table for 2025. I think there'll still be opportunities on the edges with things like the 403B provision, but a lot of it's going to be, I think, making sure that they don't do things that really adversely hurt our plans. Mike, Diana, anything to add to that?
No, agree.
Okay. So as we still kind of the same line that we gave you in Phoenix, probably playing a little more defense this year than we are looking for more ads. We do have a couple of questions, so I want to get to those, and they're both related, both talking about Social Security. So is there kind of any appetite to look at Social Security? So and just to explain that topic just a tad, and if any of you would like to go into more depth, please do. It looks like around 2033, the Social Security Trust Fund is going to even out, which means that benefits would be cut right then and there, about 23-24% from what I saw, for everybody. That's current recipients of Social Security and future recipients of Social Security. So at some point, there will need to be a bill that addresses that fact. When we talked about the weapon GPO provision and the cost of the weapon GPO elimination, it would influence that number a little bit. That's where that would show up. Maybe it speeds it up, a hair, that it wouldn't be 2033, it would be 2032 and 9 months or something like that. So do any of you want to talk about, have you heard anything? There have been some several times, on the campaign trail, Social Security was brought up. As I think Michael mentioned, both candidates proposed not taxing Social Security benefits, which would also speed up that cliff and when we would when the trust fund would even out. So is there any appetite for addressing any of that in the near term, or is the inclination to kind of wait as long as we can?
Yeah, I think Social Security is obviously very difficult to deal with politically. I think from a technical perspective, there aren't that many options for what you do with it to maintain solvency. And so, the options are what they are. We're all pretty aware of the levers you can pull to make changes. But
Raise taxes
politically,
or do cut benefits.
yeah,
So you're too-
exactly.
or
Raise
some
taxes,
combination.
Cut benefits or both, right?
Yeah, that's not particularly
They both
hard.
suck.
It's just math. But the politics are absurdly complicated because it is a program that is almost, not quite, but almost universal and widely beloved. I think there's 86+% popularity for the program. So the question is, do they have to tackle it? And the question is, they don't actually have to do anything. Benefits automatically adjust if they do nothing. Now, politically, that is a painful result to have 25% benefit cuts on folks, but it's a possible option. And the question is for politicians is waiting and trying to deal with the fallout from that easier politically than taking the political hits now to try and proactively fix it when the fixes are smaller and less painful. And I think we kind of all probably know the answer to that. Kicking the ball or has been punting a bit, has been viewed as more politically advantageous. And I don't think that there's much going to change on that front. I can't imagine a world where the president comes out and says, yeah, I'm okay with Social Security cuts. And if that's the case, then no one in his party are going to really seriously pursue them, at least not in the leadership. So I see it as very unlikely that they tackle Social Security, but you never know. In the larger discussion about debt deficits and spending, Social Security is something you kind of have to think about. So there'll definitely be discussions.
I think it will get a little attention as a result of the presidential campaign's proposals, and that puts a little bit of a spotlight on the issue because that money was part of the last fix. But I totally agree with Michael. I don't see there being the political will now to do a bipartisan approach. And even if one party wanted to do a partisan approach, which I don't know why they would and own it all themselves, there are limitations in the budget reconciliation rules to dealing with Social Security as part of it. But it's one of the 5 or 6 points of order. So I think it's pretty unlikely, but you could see it come up a little bit as part of the debate, if for no other reason than because of that proposal.
And as you mentioned,
yeah,
and as you mentioned, Michael, the earlier it's addressed, the smaller those either tax raises or benefit cuts would be. We've known about this for quite a while, frankly. It could have been done, some decades ago, but it would have been, it only affects the here and the now, right? So the longer we wait, the bigger those changes are. But
there was actually a deal in place. My buddy worked on it Speaker Boehner and President Obama had a kind of a deal in principle that I think maybe neither could sell to their folks, but that was 13 years ago. I think that's been the last meaningful discussion, which is kind of sad to your point, man.
Okay. Well, on that note, I think we'll wrap up. So, just to summarize a little bit, we're waiting on guidance for Secure 2.0. We will tell you as soon as we get it. But, hopefully the catch-up provision, we get some guidance on soon. The other guidance may take a little while, depending on how fast the transition is and how smooth everything goes. But we will be working with lawmakers as soon as we know who those committees are and who those staff are to advocate on your behalf and make sure that we're doing everything we can to prevent anything bad from happening to government defined contribution plans as they look at the tax bill for next year. So much to do. Michael, Brigen, Diana, thank you for joining me. I know you're going to be busy this year. Excited to keep working together. Thanks for everybody for attending, and take care. Have a great week.
Thank you.